welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2017. We're now in week 3 and only 3 days to go in this online festival of ideas. So don't miss out on the final 3 days and the over 200 hours of content that's available for you on demand on the DIF website. I'm joined here in the live studio by Dr. Subramanian Ramamoorthy, who is Associate Professor in the School of Informatics at the University of Edinburgh and Vice President of 5AI, a UK-based startup company focusing on technology for autonomous driving. Ram is keen to share with us his views on why people shouldn't be worried about the coming of machines, and we'll be talking to us about what robotics actually are, what their capabilities are, and what are the main issues that don't get talked about. So stay tuned to find out more. Ram, you have recently written many publications, one of which is titled Adaptable Pouring, Teaching Robots Not to Spill. And so for me, this kind of contextualizes where a lot of the active work is going on in robotics, which is slightly distinctive from maybe the archetypes that societally we talk about when it comes to the taking over of machines and the kind of Terminator style models that some of us have in our minds when we think about robots. So can you kind of talk us through the history a little bit of where we've come from with robotics that's maybe led to a kind of over-exaggeration and the kind of sci-fi way that people look at robotics today? Thank you.
Sure. Firstly, thanks, Jules, for having me here. It's great to be part of the Disruptive Innovation Festival. So as a roboticist, we look back at a long history of people trying to replicate human capabilities. I think it goes back, at least to Leonardo da Vinci, probably even earlier than that to the ancients. People have always tried to replicate human capacity. Speaking for myself and actually for a large number of my colleagues, we really think about robotics as trying to replicate these capacities so that we can help people in one way or the other. So one interesting tidbit is the fact that the word robot comes from a play written by Karl Čapek, where robot referred to labor. And we still think about robots as essentially somehow replicating human labor so that they can help us. So in order for us to achieve anything like this, we have to first figure out how to create it. So it's one thing to say it would be, we can have machines that do this, but as people at the coalface, we have to figure out how precisely will such a machine actually get built. And so it's interesting from that point of view to go back and look a little bit at the history. So in the first video clip that we have, we're going to look at 2 different types of robots. One of them is a humanoid robot, and by humanoid I mean robots that are like us and have to some extent, to the extent possible, our form factor. And the second one is what we would call a mobile robot, mobile meaning it can move around. And it doesn't particularly have a humanoid form factor, but it replicates a different capacity, which is the ability for people to perform spatial reasoning and navigation. So in each of these situations, we are interested in trying to understand what do people actually do. So we talked about pouring. That's a really sophisticated task because pouring is not just a matter of me sticking my hand out and doing this. If that's all you want to do, even a kid can build that machine. But what we actually do when we pour a liquid is that we reason about how would this liquid slosh in the container that I have, how much of it do I want, if I turn it like this, what happens? It's all of that reasoning that has to be encapsulated, right?
Yeah, and you're going to come on to a description of how robotics plays a role of what exists today in terms of kind of common sense and reasoning. And I think that's a kind of key topic that we certainly chatted about a bit before the session, and we can share with the online audience today. But so should we kind of stick with this historic piece that you're talking about with the first video clip and start there?
Yes, yeah. Let's have a look at the first video clip.
Thanks.
So this robot that you see here, this is called Freddy. It's quite dear to us in Edinburgh because this was built in the department where I currently work way back in the 60s. And a surprising fact about Freddy is that although it was built a long time ago when technology was nothing like today, It actually is remarkably similar to many other such robots that you would find. Much more modern robots would have the same basic form factor. So what you see Freddy do here is manipulation. So it's doing what we would do with our fingers. And it's performing geometric reasoning to figure out if I move this thing and if I move it like this fits within this. And it's performing motion planning, which is reasoning about all the ways in which it should move its hands and fingers, such that it can construct a complicated object. And this particular feat that, as I said, was achieved way back in the 60s is a precursor to the much more complex kinds of feats that we're now attempting with pouring. The second robot that we are looking at, this is a mobile robot. It's called Shaky. It has a huge role in the history of artificial intelligence because entire streams of algorithms came out of this one project, everything from A-star search to probabilistic reasoning. And this robot was essentially built to study what would it take for a machine to be left alone in an environment by itself and for it to reason about how it gets around. Right? So again, these are kind of basic capacities that are needed, not just in humanoid robots, but also in other kinds of robots we're going to talk about today, like self-driving cars, which is something that's taking up a lot of my time these days.
That's great. Thank you for that. And you also talked about the kind of capacity of robots to collaborate with humans, and I guess that requires some form of kind of meaningful interaction. And there was an example that you maybe wanted to share with the audience around that. Should we go into that next?
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the points here, which the audience might like to think about, is that in order for robots to be useful in society, they have to somehow relate to the user. So robots aren't an end in themselves. They are actually a means to an end for some user. And so we've been looking quite a bit at how would a user actually tell the robot anything useful. So that's the context in which collaboration comes up.
And if I use the example of a website, you'd have the kind of back end to that website, which has been designed and the kind of architecture that sits behind that to provide functionality. But then importantly, the user experience and the interface of the website is what you're describing for robotics. So how do they actually interface with the environments that they work within, and create these relationships with the people who they're meant to be serving in a way. Yeah.
So let's look at then video clip 2, in which we'll see a robot. And this particular robot is called Baxter. It's made by an American company called Rethink Robotics. And in this video clip, Baxter is working with one of my PhD students, Svetlin. And what you see here is a seamless collaboration between the person and the robot. You can imagine this happening in a machine shop. You can imagine this happening in a kitchen. And it sort of doesn't matter. And what's interesting about this, going back to your point about interface, is that Svetlin isn't putting much effort in telling the robot what to do. So there are a few clever bits of engineering in there. He's wearing a special kind of glasses that looks at where his eyes are looking so that we know where he's paying attention. There are cameras in the environment that tell us how is he moving his hands, what's on the table. And using all of that, the robot is making an inference to the fact that this is what he's trying to do. If that's what he's trying to do, this is what I should do. And so the robot is kind of seamlessly reasoning about what the person is doing, its beliefs about what the person is doing, and it's trying to come up with the best way in which it can make itself useful. So going back to this point about are robots going to take over the world, we are trying very hard actually to build robots like this that might become prevalent in the world, but not really with the objective of taking over anything. It's more to help us.
So there's a question that's come in from the live audience, George at Think Diff, that kind of points to this topic, and I'd encourage our live audience to keep the questions coming in. We've got Colin Webster keeping those plugged into this iPad here so that Ram and I can chat through your questions, so keep feeding them in. So George wants to know, the robots we saw don't look threatening, but does Moore's law mean that they are likely to rapidly develop within the next decade and become what we might see as more of a threat to society?
Yeah. So actually, the robots don't look threatening by design. It's not because we couldn't make them. There are other robots that we haven't used video clips of that are actually quite threatening.
Yeah.
But the point is, no engineer actually goes about their day thinking, how can I make a really threatening robot? That's not what we do. So what we are really after is, I want to solve a problem. And the problem might be that I want to build a nurse that's so effective that the surgeon can get the operation done in half the time. Or, in the case of the car, I want to build this vehicle that's going to take people from one place to the other so seamlessly that they'd wonder why they wasted their time driving. So in all of these cases, we are not trying to build a machine that is threatening, not because we can't do it, but because I don't see why we would do it.
So just picking up on that point, I think there is a kind of a real service aspect to what you're describing. You're trying to create kind of technologies that serve humanity. But what about when robots get used in contexts that maybe play to some people's benefits but not others? So in a defense example, I think robotics are being used more in war and defense. Yeah. And in those cases, they might be designed with a different intent. What's your view on that?
So to one extent, the answer to that question is about the same as the answer for the iPad you're holding. So, all of these devices can do certain things. If they are used with a malicious intent, then the outcome is not going to be good. And robots are no different from that. Robots are slightly more capable in terms of how they can affect the physical world in ways that your iPad cannot. But roughly speaking, the way in which we think about the governance of technology is the same. So we would still need to think about the context in which a robot is applied. And I don't think it's so much about how the robot looks or what it can do. It is more about how you govern the technology and its infrastructure so that it's being used in a sensible way. So beyond that, I agree that one has to think about safe use of technology. But I don't think that should hinder progress in the basic technology, especially given all these other much more interesting uses of the technology.
Can I ask a question on that in terms of what governance structures you feel are in place that are helping to negate some of those negative intents that people might have of utilising this technology as it stands? Are there any international bodies that are looking at that?
Yeah, so if you go back to much simpler use cases, so robots are being used routinely in factories, let's say automotive factories, and there they are subject to all the rules and regulations of all machinery that would be used in such a factory. So there are IEEE standards that talk about exactly what safety would mean. There are standards that regulate how a robot should come in contact with people. So these things are already being looked at. It's not as if these questions haven't been considered. Yeah. They of course become much more extreme if you allow the robot to learn for itself and adapt for itself. But I think it would be an evolution of the same kind of standards and legal framework that we've already been looking at. And associated with that, there's also an interesting movement that's been going on recently about trying to get algorithms to be slightly more transparent. Much of the regulation there has been around sort of electronic commerce and infrastructure like that. But I think the same principles would apply to AI and robotics as well. Mm. And there's going to be a need, so especially if a robot is going to collaborate like this, there's going to be a need for people to say, why did you do that? And then the robot can say, I did that because I thought you were doing this.
So when we were preparing for this conversation, you were using that terminology around safety in terms of being able to interrogate the machine to understand how and why it's making decisions. So you feel like that's quite a critical criteria to allow us to become, create machines that are more safe and negate some of these factors that are in the public domain and kind of talked about as being potential issues.
Yeah, so I'm involved in a number of projects right now, and they're funded by agencies ranging from DARPA in the US to the UK government agencies that are interested in offshore energy, and then also the automotive sector, where there's a big push towards trying to achieve explainability and interpretability in AI. And that applies to robotics as well. And so we are interested in this idea of can an intelligent system, especially a learning system, explain to you why it's doing something, so that that becomes, in my opinion, the foundation for safety. So it's one thing to say, you know, I've looked at this piece of algorithm or code and I've proved that it's correct. That's interesting, but increasingly we have codes that cannot be interrogated like that. What's probably much more feasible is that we can look at a system and say, you did this, why did you do that? The system says, but I saw this, and then you can say, no, there was nothing there, you're just confused. And now you know that there was a bug, you can fix it. Or you might say, why did you do that? And then the system gives you a line of reasoning, and you realize actually that it wasn't malicious, it was just an accident. And these kinds of things would then allow the user to gain trust in the use of this system. And I think that then slowly becomes the foundation on which we could build safety, in much the same way that if I was working with you, I would trust you not because I have some proof of your non-maliciousness. It's because I've spoken to you for some time and I trust you.
And you talked about the transparency that's required for kind of maybe third parties to also have access to some of that information, so that they can also feel that they're able to go through that interrogation process independently.
Yeah, maybe at this point it would be useful to use our third video clip, which is actually a demonstration of all the scenarios that are seen by an autonomous vehicle. So, so when we play the video clip, what we are going to see is the first-person view of a car that's driving itself in a typical urban environment, not unlike what we would see outside in the street. And you'll see as we go through this video, the car faces a number of different challenges. So it has challenges such as the fact that the environmental conditions look different. Might be the same road that looks different in rain and in snow. The car has to reason about everybody else who's on the road. And every now and then you'll see it make a move. For instance, you can imagine somebody wanting to ask, why did you swerve? And it says, but that's because that driver was going to come into my lane. Or you might ask, why did you brake? And it says, well, the child was going to jump in. And these are all issues that we know that the autonomous system has to face. And we are writing learning algorithms, sometimes in bits and pieces that are later being put together. So one piece of the puzzle here is, can you get the robot to explain itself to you? Another interesting piece, especially if you paid attention to that cardboard box that was flying through, is that these robots need to have some notion of common sense understanding of the environment that they're in. Whether it's a box flying in front of you or whether it's a person who's probably going to cross the street, you have to have some notion that I think this is what is going to happen. So when we see a piece of paper fly in front of us, we know that it's a piece of paper because nothing else flies quite like that. When we see a person hesitate, we know that they're deliberating because they might jump in. And we use exactly. So we use all of these judgments and reasoning and reasoning about interaction, so that based on that we can come up with good policies for action, which is what we are trying to put into these cars, and which is what we are trying to put into the humanoid robots that we saw earlier, which was reasoning about, what does Svetlin really want? Oh, he wants this, so I'm going to give him this tool.
So we've got some other questions coming in from the live audience, and there's one about your favourite type of robot, which we'll come to in a minute. But before that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Henrietta, who's going to give us a quick overview of some of the Don't Miss sessions that you might want to get on demand at the DIF website, and also some of the sessions that we've got coming up in the last 3 days of DIF.
Thanks, Jules. Hello, everyone. There have been so many great DIF sessions throughout this festival. So if you're looking for some inspiration, here are a few recommendations that you can find on DIF on demand. There's a fascinating session on water and the circular economy. Tune in to hear views on lumbering linear systems, pushing through fear, and how empowering employees and communities can lead to innovation. This session is hosted by our very own Nick Jeffries, who's joined by 3 water experts. A different topic, also close to my heart, is understanding more about the informal sector in developing countries. Not only the areas where improvements could and should be made, but also what we can learn from these oftentimes entrepreneurial and nimble systems. So if that topic also interests you, I recommend watching How Integrating Informal Work is an Opportunity for Cities in Developing Countries. We learn about the robustness of the informal sector, how tech might help breach the gap between big business and existing systems, and the part the government plays. And although there are only a few more days left of the diff, there are still plenty of good topics coming up. For example, the session on building urban habitats for humans. Why are we bad at it and how can we do better? Which is scheduled for 2 p.m. GMT this Friday with Ian Boyd, who is co-founder of Articology, who bring together design for the built environment with biological health and well-being. And of course, you can catch up on even more sessions via Diff on Demand at thinkdiff.co. You can also keep up to date with all the news on Twitter @ThinkDiff and #ThinkDiff. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Back to you, Jules.
Thanks very much, Henrietta. It's great to hear what's coming up. I want to plug back into that question I mentioned from Derek, who wrote this on the website, who wants to know what your favourite robot is out of 3CPO, Optimus Prime, K9 and Kit from Knight Rider.
So as with every good parent, one doesn't pick favorites. But I guess I must say, so the robot that I have thought about the most among all of these would probably be C3PO.
Nice. What is it that you enjoy about that character?
So it's an extremely dynamic machine. I mean, so you almost get the feeling that, this is a person.
Yeah.
And that's actually how we want to see robots. We want these robots to be relatable at that level. And going back to your earlier question, that is why I don't think we'll have bizarrely threatening machines, because they wouldn't be popular with anybody, whereas C3PO would be.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a real thing about kind of creating that sense of character and personality within a machine. And I know a lot of the kind of latest sci-fi stuff looks at machines that are really able to kind of replicate human personalities in a very real way. And there's a question here that kind of talks to this distinction between humans and robots. Is there a difference between how we trust people and how we trust robots, especially if they're autonomous? I think people might have superstitions about their motivations. Is there also the hacking element? If people hack them, can trust be eroded?
Yes, that's a very important issue. So I think there certainly is a difference between people and robots, simply because robots are at this point so clearly inanimate that people find, it seems a bit hard for you to trust it in quite the same way that you would relate to a person and trust that person. But if you're asking about trust at the level of, would you allow it to do something, then think about it this way. So a fighter pilot who's sitting in, one of these really advanced aircrafts, he's intrinsically trusting this machine because he's going to die when a mistake is made. And he's perfectly happy flying up on this machine, day in and day out. And the same thing happens with all kinds of autonomous systems that we allow ourselves to be part of. So we are trusting these machines. We are not trusting them the same way, but we have trust that it's okay for me to sit in this and I can do it. So that's really how we should be approaching trust, because to get the same level of relatability as a person requires you to completely replicate everything about the person. That's hard. But if you can reach the point when a surgeon is okay to say, here's the scalpel, you can work with it, then I think we're making progress.
And you've talked about kind of design for social good when it comes to robotics, and how robotics are able to cover kind of labour tasks that maybe aren't suitable for human beings to be performing those tasks. And I think a lot of there is a lot of debate as well, because a lot of people are earning their living. They're getting a basic income from factory work, for example, which I think over the course of time there is a kind of scenario that those jobs will be displaced.
Yeah.
What is your kind of personal view on how we navigate our way through that transition so that we're actually enabling those communities to still have access to income, but yet also creating a transition that means that people are no longer doing tasks that are actually maybe not suitable for human beings to be fulfilling?
Yeah. I think this issue of, what do you do when certain kinds of jobs are being automated away, it's a very important one. But I'd like to start by saying, firstly, that it's not actually a new question at all. Because, going back to many centuries, the same thing has been happening throughout history. So most recently, somebody told me about a job that I didn't know quite existed, where this person works at the BBC, and she said one of her first jobs was to ferry little slips of paper from one person sitting in an office to another place where the typist pool was. Now, there's no person ferrying these slips anymore, and there is no typist pool. And so all of those jobs are gone, but I have a strong feeling that many of those people did get alternate jobs. So I think that's how we should be approaching the question of jobs still. But then that doesn't, absolve us of the responsibility to think about, what do we do now? And I do think that, we should be looking at what kind of new jobs can be created even as some of these old jobs are going away. They're not particularly glamorous jobs, though, some of the ones that are going away. And I think the people doing them would agree, because in many, many cases, the people doing them would encourage younger people in their own families not to do these jobs and to do something else. So they agree with this sentiment. It's just that we have to make sure that we are thinking at the governmental level and economic level about creating alternate economies within which all of these people can plug in.
We've also got a question from Andy who asks what your best example is of robots designed for social good.
There are many examples. I mean, the easy ones would be, if I were to point at, for instance, some of these robots that are being used in medical contexts, or some of these robots that are, delivering goods from one place to the other. For instance, one really interesting one that I hadn't known about, so I'll pick that, not because that's the most technologically sophisticated, but it's interesting, is that in certain parts of Africa where land transport is really difficult, they found that if you can use a flying machine, a UAV or a drone as it's sometimes called, to deliver medical goods from one place to the other, then it's extremely efficient. So they set up a network of drones that would move, blood from a blood bank to wherever it's needed, medicines from, different places to where it's needed. And this delivery network is now so well functioning that it has actually changed the medical outcomes of that sector in that region. So for me, it's those kinds of applications that we should really be striving towards, where you build a technology, it replicates a certain capacity, and then it plugs into an infrastructure which actually changes the world for the good.
We had a conversation about what exists today in terms of technology and what, how that compares to human capabilities. And from a learning perspective, I mean, here at the Foundation, we do a huge amount around learning about the circular economy. And at the Disruptive Innovation Festival, we hope that our global community is learning about all of these new topics that we put out through the DIF. And on the fourth video clip, you were going to exemplify this point a bit with your own kind of personal story of people learning very, very effectively in a way that robots currently can't.
Yeah.
So should we have a look at that video?
Yeah. So the context behind this video is that this is my daughter Siona when she was just learning to walk, and it's a video that some of my colleagues have seen many times. And the interesting thing about this video is that this is the first time in her life, and I know this because I'm her dad and I set this up, this is the first time in her life that she tried this task of standing up on a wobbly surface. She knew how to walk on hard ground, but not stand on wobbly surfaces. And this video clip is maybe 3 or 4 trials taken from about 12 trials over just one night. And she had mastered the task. So all she needed was roughly about 45 seconds of input. And she had figured out how to do it. But not just that, she was most likely, and here it's conjecture, she was most likely using all the information she had about how do soft surfaces behave and how does my body behave and what is a common sense way to do this. And so it's that capacity that as a roboticist and as a scientist, we are trying to replicate and codify. And it's until we do that, it's a bit of it's not a very relevant question to ask, are robots going to take over the world and what are they going to do? Because any autonomous agent that's actually useful in an open-ended environment has to be able to learn like this. And our hope is that if we can figure out how these kind of capacities can be built, then we can use them for good. And there's actually a clip that follows on from this one. So that clip was taken when she was much, much younger. And then the next clip is when she had grown up a bit. And so now she didn't need to do even those 12 trials. So in this next task, when you play the clip, this next task, we were just walking around Rome, and we said, is it possible for you to jump up in just the right way so that you can do this? And she just thought about it for a while, asked me what I wanted. And in the very first attempt, she just knew exactly what to do. So she's reached this point where it's not just that she's robust at tasks that she can perform, she's robust at tasks that she hadn't thought about when she was learning how to do them, and she's just figuring out how to do it. So as a roboticist, what I'm working towards is to be able to make machines that are that capable. So the scientific question is, how would you do that? And then the social question is, if you could do that, then how would you plug it into society as we know it, so that the robot could just be one other person who's sitting here, equals among us and acting like us.
And we talked earlier about your, the needs for, this kind of revolution to take place in a way that does provide social good. So there is this thing around the kind of common sense that robots require, at the piece around reasoning that we've talked about. And, looking at your daughter as an example, a lot of what she is able to do there is based on her life experience. So it's a huge amount of data and trial and error and failure and kind of success that has allowed her to become that very highly adaptive being. And what I'm kind of picking up from your argument is that currently that kind of accelerated level of learning doesn't exist today. There's a question that has come in who from another member of the online community is pitching some questions, who's saying, what do you think of Elon Musk's argument that the kind of sentient robotics pose a threat to humankind? And I think that you're putting an argument forward that we need to be looking at ways of creating that sort of level of capability and coherence in robotics, but then there's also very highly kind of in the public domain these individuals, and I think Stephen Hawkins was another one. He maybe doesn't come from the engineering or robotics background, but these public figures are putting out warning signals. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, and I think this is a question that's somewhat related to the jobs question, or at least it's in a similar spirit. And as I said there, as a community, and both as a scientific community and as a social community, we should be certainly aware that as these machines become more and more capable, we have to worry about all of these issues. I think it's very much premature for us to worry about many of the extreme examples that are being put out. So these notions that these robots are going to become so much more capable that they're going to surpass humans and they're going to take over. I mean, that's interesting. I don't see any evidence that we are anywhere near that yet. I don't even see evidence that that's going to happen in my lifetime. But let's say that it is going to happen at some point. So my perspective is actually that if we are actually creating such a capable machine, then that capable machine is also going to be able to have arguments with us. It's going to talk to us. We're going to be able to convince them. So I would ask the question this way. There are many people in the world who have every intention of taking over the world. And somehow we manage to convince them or set up society in such a way that they don't do really bad things. Sometimes they do, but we have a social mechanism for dealing with them. So maybe if robots had the same level of ability to relate to you, listen to argument, provide arguments, then you would convince robots as well. So this idea that they are completely separate, but then they have all of these capabilities, that seems a little bit at odds to me. So if they were that capable, then they would probably talk to you and you would use all of rhetoric and all of persuasion to persuade them not to do bad things, or at least to do them, within reason in ways that you know how to govern.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like the governance piece is quite critical to this transition process. There's a question here of somebody, Seba, on the live audience who said that he watched the David Heinberger session last night, who's an author on AI and especially on machine learning. He suggests that AI will have knowledge that we can never understand, but he didn't believe that a robotic or AI could ever achieve consciousness. It was a question, A, are you familiar with his work, and what's your view on the topic of consciousness when it comes to robotics?
So I'm not familiar with his work, and I only heard about it earlier today when we were talking about it here. So the idea that, robots and AI have access to more data than we have access to, that's probably true, I agree. But at the same time, as I just showed you with some of these video clips, they don't yet have the capacity to learn at this general level where they can, draw these very deep inferences. So we still have an edge when it comes to that. But let's say that, one of these days that's going to happen, and robots are going to be able to learn, and they're going to learn all the time and from a lot of data. In principle, then, I don't see why they couldn't replicate whatever it is that we mean by consciousness. So, one of the first things I should point out is that the question of what is consciousness, that itself is, is rather contentious, and not everybody knows. So if I were to go with the view of what I think it might be, which is that you have the ability to reflect upon yourself, in a recursive way and in a very deep way, then there's no particular reason why you couldn't computationally achieve the same thing. And in fact, there are very good arguments, there are very good models, and many of my colleagues, such as Andy Clark, who's a philosopher in the University of Edinburgh, with him, I've recently written a paper on this topic. And we believe that if you take this kind of a computational view of consciousness, then there's no particular reason why you couldn't replicate it. But of course, the actual question of could you create such a machine as a tangible artifact, that's a completely different question. And as I said, we are so far from that I don't think anybody knows how to do that. If it's an in-principle mathematical question of, could you do such a thing, then I think the answer is yes. You could create it, and many, many people have written, to that effect and tried to explain why and how you would go about it.
So obviously with your work within the startup 5AI, you look particularly at autonomous vehicles, and it's a big topic in today's society. I know that there are already examples of autonomous vehicles on the road. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this transition playing out over the next 10 years, and how much you feel that that self-driving cars will start to displace driven human-operated vehicles?
Yeah, so the first thing you should know, just like with my very first clip about history, is that self-driving cars aren't a new phenomenon. So they go back at least to the 1980s, I believe, if I've got the dates right, when a German team working with Mercedes actually created the first self-driving van. And they created a van because they needed that much space to keep the computer. And then many, many times since then, including a team at Carnegie Mellon, and then many, many teams through the DARPA Grand Challenge, and now really a large number of companies are trying to do this. So what all of us are struggling with is the fact that there's a very basic notion of what it means to drive, which is, you see a road, you see some lanes, you stick to it, and you just follow those lanes. That kind of driving we know how to do. In fact, even student projects these days are able to replicate that. And then the next level above that would be the video clip that we saw, where a car is able to deal with all of these difficulties of what happens if the visual perception changes, what happens if people jump in, what happens if the other car swerves. And so all of us are kind of struggling with that level of autonomy. I think once we reach a point when we can reliably achieve that autonomy, and then we can show that it is safe to some extent, then I think we'd be able to go on the road. There are a number of dates that are being put out there. We are attempting to do our own first road trials by 2019.
Okay.
There was an announcement recently by the UK government that by 2021 they'd like to see these things happen on the road. There are many, many American companies that are going with dates like 2020. So we're not very far from, serious trials happening on the roads. And I would argue that technologically we are at a position when it makes sense to conduct many of these trials. But that, of course, doesn't mean that all the cars are suddenly going to become self-driving. That maybe we are a little bit further away from. But we're going to take steps. And I think the steps are going to be in the nature where the first vehicles that come on the road, they come in some kind of a service capacity. So they replace certain kinds of vehicles that you see. Maybe they take over some of the roles of taxis, maybe they take over the roles of buses and trams, and then they could plug into the infrastructure networks, for instance. So I think the real question we should be asking is not when will they replace each other's personal cars, but how can they actually plug into whatever it is that we call the transportation infrastructure, and how can we engineer this whole thing such that it becomes better. So if we could, for instance, engineer many of these things to be autonomous machines, then we have the capacity to optimize the whole infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I could now plan routes, I could plan traffic, I could look for ways in which the entire traffic network is trying to be fuel conscious, lower emission, lower congestion. So there are ways in which all of this could really play to our favor.
And where are the kind of main innovations in terms of taking that step beyond just the debate of individual vehicles and more into a systems debate about transportation? Are there any kind of case examples or experiments that are going on that look at that interconnectivity with broader transport systems that you can reference?
I don't know of any specific project that is yet at that scale. There may be, and I just may not be aware of them. What I can say is, if you look within the UK, the body that's heavily involved in helping and governing this space is called the Center for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. So autonomous vehicles is one piece, and connected vehicles is the other piece. So actually, at the very top level, people are thinking about this whole thing as being one interrelated problem. And I certainly think that the case for things like self-driving vehicles, if it's just a novelty that, look, I can do this, that's interesting. But I think the case becomes really compelling when you can say, because I can do this, I can give you all of these additional benefits that you weren't able to get. So one very interesting example is that when Amazon went from having its warehouses be manned by people to having them be manned by robots, what they found is that suddenly they had optimizations that they could do that weren't possible before. So if you have people working in your warehouses, then there is some upper bound on how complex an instruction you can give them. You can say, maybe for the next hour do this, and after that do this. But if it's just machines, thousands of them, you could do whatever you want. For the next 30 milliseconds, do this and then do that, and then do it with that guy and coordinate. So you have the capacity to optimize in a very, very intricate way. And I think that's what you could do with the traffic network as well. Once you have all of them be digital, then you can get benefits like that. I don't think that we are at a position yet where even the individual pieces are worked out to the extent that we can do that grand experiment. But I don't think we are very far either. And in fact, I would hope that very quickly we'll get these individual pieces figured out, and before a decade or so, we should have the grander experiments playing out. Yeah.
It's great personally to hear that, from a traffic perspective. I think every single one of us can tell stories of the negative impacts that being stuck in traffic has on society and productivity. But I also really like what you've finished up with there as your point around how can the functionality of individual robots actually support a broader systems level optimization. And I think that for me feels like the really important next step. That's been a real learning from my perspective, is that there is this progression now into moving beyond the kind of the view of you as a kind of scientist who understands the realities of developing these functionalities with individual machines, but then you're also really pushing the debate into how can these individual machines play a role in optimizing broader systems, and the transportation system being a great example of that. We're unfortunately out of time. I'd just like to give you the opportunity to make any final closing comments from your side. It's felt like a very fast 45 minutes from my perspective, and I really appreciate you coming down to join us here in the live studio. So just any closing comments from you, Ram?
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. It'll be hard for me to summarize or add much more. But then I just go back then to the original question that we asked, which is, should we be worried about an invasion? And I would say, no more than we are worried about invasions of other people coming here. So I think we should really be welcoming it from the point of view of it makes our experience much more diverse.
So no more to fear than an alien invasion.
Maybe.
Okay, that's a positive point to finish on. And thank you very much for coming down to join us here in the live studio. So do make sure you plug into the on-demand sessions, over 200 hours of content that you can catch up on through the diff. And we have plenty more coming up over the last 3 days that Henrietta shared with us. And there are also some more specific sessions on AI that you might want to look at that we referred to in this session, how humans can thrive when machines are smarter than us. So plenty more to plug into here at thinkdiff.co, and look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks very much. Bye for now.